Chapter 3. I took Carly by the hand and we both followed Muddy, running through the snow after Marlene. But the snow was deep and we soon tired and were reduced to a walk. Ahead of us, the chase went on. However hard the dog tried to bound away over the snow and escape, Marlene kept after him. All the while her trumpeting was echoing through the park and louder now in my ears than seemed possible, until I began to realize that it was not Marlene's trumpeting I was hearing at all, but the sound of the air raid sirens wailing over the city. I stopped to listen, to be quite sure my ears were not playing tricks on me. Carly gripped my arm. "An air raid," he cried. "An air raid." All I knew then was that we had to get to the shelter fast, as we had been taught. Ahead of us, Muddy too had stopped in her tracks. She was yelling out to Marlene to come back. Again and again she called, but Marlene just kept going. She was almost out of sight now and in among the trees as Muddy came stumbling back toward us. "There is nothing more we can do for now, children," she said. "We shall find her later. We must get home to the shelter. Come quickly." She grabbed Carly's hand. "No," Carly cried, pulling away from her and turning to run. "No, we can't. We can't leave her. We have to catch her. I'm going after her." "You go home if you like. I'm not coming." Carly, don't be silly. You come back here this minute. Do you hear me?" Muddy was shouting after him, shrieking almost, but I could see it was pointless, that Carly had made up his mind. I started running after him then, so did Muddy, but he was already way ahead of us, and Marlene was by now no more than a shadowy shape moving through the trees, and then I lost sight of her altogether. We were catching up with Carly fast when, and not for the first time, he staggered and fell to his knees, exhausted. Muddy and I were trying to help him up, doing all we could to persuade him that we had to get back to the shelter. He was still protesting, still struggling against us, fighting us, when we heard the sound we had been dreading for so long. The bombers. The bombers were coming. It sounded like a distant humming at first, then it became a droning, like a swarm of bees, a swarm that was coming closer, ever closer. We looked up. We could still see no planes. We could not tell from which direction they were coming, because they seemed to be all around us, but invisible. Then, in no time at all, the sky above us was filled with a thunderous throbbing roar, so loud that I thought my ears might burst. Carly had his hands over his ears and was screaming, and then the bombs began to fall, behind us, on the city, on the far side of the park, on where we had come from, our street, our house. The whole world shuddered and shook with every blast. To me, it felt like the end of the world had come. Now we had no choice. All of us knew that moment there could be no going back. Muddy picked Carly up in her arms. He clung on and buried his head in her shoulder, crying out for Marlene. And we ran, and we ran. We did not know tiredness anymore. Fear alone kept our legs running. I looked up once more and saw the planes flying across the moon. There were hundreds of them up there. By now the bombs were falling all over Dresden. We heard the whine of them falling, the crump and crunch of them, saw the flash of explosions, saw fires raging everywhere. There was no more argument, not about Marlene, who had disappeared into the night by now, and not about returning home to the shelter. Marlene we could do nothing more about, and it was obvious that if there was any way of escaping the bombs, it would be in the open country ahead of us, beyond the suburbs, not in a shelter back in the burning city. It was the city where the bombing, not the countryside. We only had to keep going, I told myself. We would soon be out of the park, into the outskirts of the city, closer, all the time, to the safety of the fields and the woods beyond. We tried not to, but we had to stop from time to time to catch our breath. And whenever we did, we would stand there, gazing back at the city. Our city it was, and it was being destroyed before our eyes. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky. Anti-aircraft guns were firing, pounding away, but the planes just kept on coming. The blast of their bombs, ever nearer, ever louder, roaring up in our ears. The flames from burning houses and factories were licking high into the sky, leaping from one building to the next, from one street to the next, from one fire to another, each fire, it seemed to me, seeking out another fire to be with, so it could become an inferno, so it could burn more furiously. Time and again we turned away from it and ran on, partly because the heat was so intense and partly because we could bear to watch no longer. We were out of the park by now, out onto the road through the suburbs. A sudden wind was getting up, a strong, fierce wind that gusted in our faces as we walked. We leaned into the wind and staggered on through the snow. We followed the road to the top of a steep hill, and by then, Muddy could carry Carly no further. She had to stop. We found ourselves on our knees in the snow, looking back down at the city and the ring of fire that now encircled it entirely. Kneeling there, we heard quite distinctly through the drone of the bombers the sound of shooting, and we could hear screaming. One look at Muddy's horrified face, and I knew this screaming for what it was, the shrieking of animals, of dying animals, and that it came from the direction of the zoo. They were shooting the animals. Muddy put her hands over Carly's ears and hugged him to her. She wept then, uncontrollably, as much in anger as in grief, I thought. Carly and I put our arms around her to do our best to comfort her. There we knelt, the wind searing hot on our faces now, while the shooting went on and the bombs fell and the city burned. In the end, it was neither Carly nor me who brought her comfort. Instead, it was the sound of breathing close behind us, and then, miraculously, Marlene's trunk winding itself around us and folding us. That was the moment I remember so well because all three of us burst out laughing through our tears. We had gone looking for Marlene, lost her, and now she had found us. We were on our feet at once, overjoyed, Carly kissing her trunk again and again, and Muddy stroking her ear, but telling her how naughty she had been to run away like she had. I looked up to Marlene's face and saw the fires of the city burning in her troubled eyes. She knew what was happening, understood everything. I was sure of it. I think it was Marlene's sudden, unexpected reappearance that gave us all fresh hope, new strength, Muddy most of all. "Well, children," she said, brushing the snow off her coat, "we have no house to go back to, and certainly there will be very little left of the city. So I have been thinking. There is only one place we can go. We shall go to the farm, to Uncle Manfred and Aunt Lottie. It is a long, long way to go on foot, but there is nowhere else." "But you and Poppy," I said, "you told us we could never go back to the farm, not after—" "I know," Muddy told them, "but we have no choice, have we? We shall be needing food and shelter. They will look after us, I know they will. It was a family row we had, that is all. I am sure everything is forgiven by now, and that we can all put it behind us. When we get there, they will welcome us with open arms. It will be fine, I promise you. You will see." "Elizabeth," Carly said, his hand stealing into mine. "Elizabeth, why do they do this terrible thing? Why have the bombers come?" "Because they are our enemies, and because they hate us," I told him, "and because they are brutes. To do this, they must be brutes, the Americans, the British, all of them." "Why do they hate us?" he asked me. Muddy answered for me then, and I was glad she did because I had no answer to give him. "If they hate us, Carly," she said, "it is because we have also bombed their cities. What we are seeing now is a world gone mad, children, a world full of brutes, all intent on killing one another. And we should not forget that we are all responsible for making it happen, for letting it happen." As we turned and walked away, we had to cling on to one another so that the wind did not blow us back towards the city, towards the fire. The gusts of wind were so strong. I remember Carly looking up at me and pointing at the trees. "The trees in the gardens, they are shaking, Elizabeth," he said. "I think they are frightened of the wind. They want to run away like we are, but they cannot. Why is the wind blowing so hard? Why is it so angry?" Not even Muddy had an answer to that. Carly was crying then, crying for our burning home, and maybe also for the trees that were leaving behind, that could not run away. So began our long trek through the snow, along a road that was quickly becoming even more clogged, with dozens, hundreds, then thousands of others like us, streaming out of Dresden, all of us desperate to leave the city behind us. When I looked back, and I tried not to, Dresden was no longer a city anymore. Rather, it looked to me like one vast bonfire, where fire caught fire with fire, a fire whipped up by a mighty wind of its own, making, that buffeted our faces, that was doing all it could to stop us from escaping, all it could to suck us back into the burning city. There was this stifling stench of smoke all about us. Carly was finding it difficult to breathe sometimes and kept having to stop to cough the smoke out of his lungs. Muddy and I were worried that it might bring on one of his asthma attacks, but thankfully it did not. And still the planes came, still they dropped their bombs. That was the longest night of my life. I had never before witnessed human misery on such a scale. It is the sound of a people in despair that I shall never forget. The weeping, the sobbing, the screaming, and the praying. How fast we all wanted to get out of that city that night, and how slowly we were moving. We shuffled forward through the cold and the dark, most of us on foot, but many on bicycles, in cars, trucks, farm carts, everyone jostling to find some way to get ahead, to move just a little faster. So many were desperate to find someone dear they had lost, and so many were wrapped in bandages and were crying out in their pain. It was like a walk through hell, and it seemed never ending. Only the military convoys and ambulances were able to find a way through, honking their horns at us, waving us all aside. We longed with every moment to be out of the blazing suburbs into the welcome darkness of the countryside. Everyone on that road knew that there was safety in that darkness. I think that was what kept us all going. All night long we trudged on, but as the hours passed, the road became even more congested. Mostly refugees on foot like us, but many more now, it seemed, pulling carts loaded up with old people or children, their possessions piled around them. As the growl of the bombers at last died away, the air was filled with whimpering. It was as if the whole world were mourning. By first light, there was shuffling of feet to be heard, and creaking cartwheels, and occasionally a neighing horse. Looking back over my shoulder from the top of a hill, it seemed to me like a gigantic funeral procession. It was mostly one-way traffic, but at dawn, more convoys of trucks filled with soldiers came roaring past on their way back into the city, motorcycle outriders waving us frantically to one side. They were the first to take any notice of Marlene, some of them pointing at us and staring as they passed us by. As for our fellow refugees, maybe they had been too dazed, too traumatized, or just too tired to pay much attention to this young elephant that was wandering along with them. A few of the children were curious, but everyone, including the children, was subdued. There were no smiles of excitement among them, only a dull amazement. I have no idea how far we walked that first day of our long march, probably only a few kilometers, but it felt like 100. We had no food, no water.